From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! Tension is rising again on the Korean Peninsula after North Korea successfully tests an intercontinental missile that experts believe would be capable of reaching Alaska, while the U.S. and South Korea have carried out a joint ballistic missile drill in the Sea of Japan. We'll get the latest. Then 44 states are refusing a request by the Trump administration to hand over detailed information about every voter in the country.
What's happening right now is that states all across the country are rejecting President Trump's election commission. Chris Kobach, the vice chair, is the architect of voter suppression efforts nationally, and the real voter fraud in this country is this sham election commission.
Then we look at the showdown between Qatar and its Gulf neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. Will Al Jazeera be forced to shut down?
Regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with Al Jazeera politically, Al Jazeera is a professional channel that has proven itself over the past 20 years, and there is no reason to demand its closure.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States and South Korea have carried out joint ballistic missile drill in the Sea of Japan after North Korea successfully tested an intercontinental missile that experts believe would be capable of reaching Alaska. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, said this morning the missile test was a 4th of July gift to President Trump. The Pentagon also released a video last Wednesday of a U.S. long-range interceptor missile colliding with an intercontinental range missile as an apparent warning to North Korea. Tensions have been rising in recent months between the United States and North Korea. Earlier this year, the U.S. carried out massive military exercises in the Korean Peninsula and deployed an anti-missile system known as THAAD to South Korea, despite protests by South Koreans. The new South Korean President, Moon Jae-in, is also opposed to the THAAD missile system, and last month ordered an investigation after learning that 4 more missile launchers had been brought into South Korea. After the North Korean missile launch, President Trump tweeted, "Perhaps China will put a heavy move on North Korea and end this nonsense once and for all," unquote. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Russia and met with Russian President Vladimir Putin, where the two expressed their opposition to THAAD and the U.S. military drills in the region. In a joint statement issued Tuesday, China and Russia called on North Korea to suspend its ballistic missile program and called on the U.S. and South Korea to cease their massive joint military exercises. The statement also calls on the U.S. to immediately cancel the deployment of the THAAD missile system. The United Nations Security Council is holding an emergency meeting today over the North Korea missile test. Thousands of protesters marched in dozens of cities across the United States Sunday to demand President Trump's impeachment. Marchers took to the streets in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, Philadelphia, New York City, and in Davenport, Iowa, as well as other U.S. cities. These are 2 protesters in Los Angeles.
Resist, and resist loud. So loud that we won't even hear the door slam when he's dragged out of office.
I really think his mental state is unstable, and I think everyone kind of knows that, but we don't say it about our president.
Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, more than 20 Democratic lawmakers are now backing a bill introduced by Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin that would create a commission to determine if the president is mentally or physically unfit for office. The bill's gained support over the last week after Trump issued sexist tweets attacking MSNBC's Mika Brzezinski, calling her crazy and falsely claiming she was bleeding badly from a facelift. On Sunday, Trump again sparked outrage when he tweeted a doctored video of himself body slamming and punching a figure whose head has been replaced by the CNN logo. The video was an edited clip of Trump appearing at an event called WrestleMania in 2007. The video ends with the words FNN, Fraud News Network. It was posted to Trump's personal account, then retweeted by the official presidential account. The Reddit user who created the doctored video has made racist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and violent comments in the past online, including commenting on a photo of refugees by writing, quote, "There's a Moab, mother of all bombs for that," unquote, in reference to the massive bomb the U.S. dropped in Afghanistan. The user also posted a photo of Jewish staff members of CNN with stars of David next to their headshots. After being identified by CNN, the Reddit user deleted his past posts and apologized for all that he has said. In response to the video, CNN said, quote, "Instead of preparing for his overseas trip, his first meeting with Vladimir Putin, dealing with North Korea and working on his health care bill, he is instead involved in juvenile behavior, blowing the dignity of his office. We will keep doing our jobs. He should start doing his," they said about President Trump. Well, President Trump is heading to Poland Thursday, where he's slated to meet with Poland's President Andrzej Duda before giving a speech in Warsaw Square. Poland's one of the farthest right governments in Europe and is currently defying European Union rules by refusing to allow refugees into Poland. Trump will then head to the G20 summit, where he'll have an official meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin Friday afternoon. It's Trump's first meeting with Putin as president and comes as Trump faces multiple investigations over his ties to Russia. Thousands of protesters are expected to disrupt the G20 summit. On Sunday, German police attacked protesters with water cannons as thousands demonstrated against the summit, as well as President Trump. On July 14th, Trump will visit France for Bastille Day and meet with French President Emmanuel Macron. A top Justice Department official has resigned, citing President Trump. In a LinkedIn post, former corporate compliance watchdog Hui Chen wrote, quote, "On my mind were the numerous lawsuits pending against the President of the United States for everything from violations of the Constitution to conflict of interest, the ongoing investigations of potentially treasonous conducts, and the investigators and prosecutors fired for their pursuits of principles and facts. Those are conducts I would not tolerate seeing in a company, yet I worked under administration that engaged in exactly this conduct. I wanted no more part of it," unquote. A delegation of senators, including Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, Arizona Senator John McCain, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, and Rhode Island's White House, visited Afghanistan over the July 4th weekend. The group demanded President Trump fill vacant embassy and State Department positions in Afghanistan amidst what the Pentagon calls a mounting military crisis. The Trump administration has not yet even appointed a permanent ambassador to Afghanistan. Former ministers of Bahrain, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia are meeting today amidst a diplomatic standoff with the Gulf nation of Qatar. The Saudi-led coalition has issued 13 demands on Qatar, including the closing of the Al Jazeera TV channel. Other demands include ending Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood, downgrading diplomatic ties with Iran, and closing a Turkish military base in Qatar. The diplomatic standoff began soon after President Trump met Saudi King Salman in Riyadh. We'll have more on the diplomatic crisis in the Gulf later in the broadcast. In Iraq, U.S.-backed Iraqi forces are continuing to fight ISIS in a few remaining neighborhoods of Mosul. Iraqi military officials say they expect to seize control of the entire city of Mosul by the end of the week. The fighting has forced hundreds of thousands to flee the city, while U.S.-led airstrikes backing the ground offensive have reportedly killed hundreds of civilians. In Lebanon, 2 separate fires tore through Syrian refugee camps in recent days, killing at least 1 girl and injuring nearly 24 others. On Sunday, a fire burned the camp housing hundreds of Syrian refugees in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley to the ground. Another fire broke out Tuesday at a nearby camp. Meanwhile, the Lebanese army raided 2 Syrian refugee camps near the border with Syria Friday. Suicide bombers attacked the army during the raids. At least 1 small girl was killed in the conflict. In Brazil, police have arrested a close ally to President Michel Temer as part of a widening corruption investigation. Prosecutors say former cabinet minister Gedel Vera Lima tried to block an investigation into corruption at a government-controlled bank. His arrest comes as Temer himself has been charged with corruption and is facing increasing calls to resign or be ousted. Canada will issue an apology to and pay $10 million to Omar Khadr for the abuses he suffered while imprisoned by the United States at Guantanamo. Born in Toronto, Canada, Khadr was detained in 2002 by U.S. forces in Afghanistan before being transferred to Guantanamo at the age of 16. Khadr became the first person since World War II to be prosecuted in a war crimes tribunal for acts committed as a juvenile. After 8 years at Guantanamo, he confessed in 2010 to throwing a grenade that killed an American soldier in Afghanistan. His lawyers say his statements were illegally obtained through torture and cruelty. In Honduras, 26-year-old Berta Zuniga Cáceres, the daughter of the murdered Honduran indigenous environmental leader Berta Cáceres, has survived an attempted attack by a group of men wielding machetes. The attack comes just weeks after Bertita Zuniga was named the new leader of COPING, the group formerly led by her mother. Last week, Zuniga also demonstrated in support of pending U.S. legislation to suspend all U.S. military aid to Honduras. This is Berta Zuniga Cáceres speaking on Radio Lanka about the legislation.
In particular, the law mandates a suspension of all military aid that the United States gives to Honduras until the murder case of Berta Cáceres is solved in an effective manner. But not just that case, but other cases that have been representative, like the cases in the Bajo-Aguan region, like the cases of Honduran environmentalists who have died defending life in this country.
We'll go to Honduras for more on the attack against Berta Cáceres and bring you that report tomorrow on Democracy Now! And Tuesday was July 4th, or Independence Day in the United States. Across the U.S., activists staged protests and demonstrations to demand justice for indigenous people, immigrants, Muslims, and others. In Texas, people blockaded the July 4th parade to protest the anti-immigrant bill SB 2, which was signed into law by Texas Governor Greg Abbott. Also in Texas, protesters heckled Senator Ted Cruz in McAllen over his support for the Republican health care bill, chanting, "Ted wants us dead." If passed, the Republican Senate health care plan could cause 22 million Americans to lose their insurance over the next decade. Meanwhile, former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick posted a video of himself on Twitter visiting Ghana, along with the words, quote, "How can we truly celebrate independence on a day that intentionally robbed our ancestors of theirs? To find my independence, I went home," Kaepernick tweeted. In New York City, members of the Council on American Islamic Relations held a teach-in inside Trump Tower to educate people about the rights of immigrants and Muslims in the United States. This is Talia Bauer.
We are at Trump Tower. We are on the 5th floor in, I'm not sure what this pavilion is called, but it was a space that was designated as like a free speech area of some sort. So we're here kind of like in the belly of the beast talking about like what this horrible space represents in terms of, 45 and in terms of capitalism and in terms of like huge wealth disparity in New York. And so we're kind of taking it over ourselves.
And finally, NPR faced an outburst of online protests from Trump supporters on July 4th after the radio network tweeted out the entire Declaration of Independence. People mistook the document and thought NPR was calling for an armed insurrection against President Trump. In response to NPR's tweets of the line, quote, "It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government," unquote, one Trump supporter replied, quote, "So NPR is calling for revolution. Interesting way to condone the violence while trying to sound patriotic. Your implications are clear," unquote. This Twitter user later apologized, writing, quote, "I was terribly stupid for this comment," unquote. And New Jersey Governor Chris Christie sparked massive outrage over the July 4th holiday after a photographer for the Star-Ledger caught him sunbathing on a public beach that Christie's budget shutdown had closed to the public. As a result, Christie and his family had the entire 10-mile-long beach to themselves. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States and South Korea have carried out a joint ballistic missile drill in the Sea of Japan after North Korea successfully tested an intercontinental missile that experts believe would be capable of reaching Alaska. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, said the missile test was a 4th of July gift to President Trump. The Pentagon has also released video of a U.S. long-range interceptor missile colliding with an intercontinental range missile as an apparent warning to North Korea. Tensions have been rising in recent months between the United States and North Korea. Earlier this year, the U.S. carried out massive military exercises in the Korean Peninsula and deployed an anti-missile system known as THAAD to South Korea, despite protests by South Koreans. The new South Korean president is also opposed to the THAAD missile system and last month ordered an investigation after learning that 4 more missile launchers had been brought into South Korea. After the North Korean missile launch, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Perhaps China will put a heavy move on North Korea and end this nonsense once and for all," unquote. We're joined now by Christine Ahn. She's founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing for peace in Korea. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Christine. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you talk about this latest escalation?
Well, as we know, North Korea tends to conduct these missile tests timed in a kind of poetic way. And as you mentioned, they said it was a gift to the Trump administration. It also happened to coincide a few days after the end of the Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump summit, in which, you know, unfortunately, President Moon, who had come into office and has about an 80% popularity rating, in many ways towed the line of the Trump administration about maximum pressure and agreeing with the U.S. policy on North Korea, which has slightly departed from his pro-engagement line and obviously the sentiments of the South Korean people. 8 out of 10 South Koreans, according to a new survey, have said they wanted inter-Korean dialogue. And so I think in many ways it was a response to that. It also happened to coincide with President Obama's visit to Seoul. And we know that the North Koreans were not very pleased with the Obama administration's strategic patience policy, which the Trump administration is basically replicating. So, you know, I think, you know, again, North Korea tests these missiles as a way to advance their capability to defend in the case of any kind of preemptive strike from the United States. And, you know, we don't know if they could put a nuclear warhead on one of these that could reach the United States. But that's the point, is they want to put the pressure on the United States, on the Trump administration, to say, we need to negotiate some kind of peace settlement because they feel threatened. And so right now, the most viable proposal that is on the table that has now, as you mentioned earlier, is backed by both China and Russia, but it originally came from the North Koreans in 2015, was to halt the U.S. and South Korean military exercises in exchange for freezing North Korea's nuclear and long-range missile program. Now, that is a deal that should be seriously considered, but the Trump administration is not accepting it. And in fact, you know, I think by virtue of not accepting it and not seriously considering it, the only way that Americans can interpret that is to say that that we value the exercises more than we value freezing North Korea's nuclear program. And so I think that this is North Korea's message to the United States. We want to negotiate, and we're going to do what we can to defend our sovereignty and our country from any kind of preemptive strike from the Trump administration.
So earlier this morning, President Trump tweeted, trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. That was Trump's tweet earlier today. And as we reported earlier, the president of China, Xi Jinping, visited Russia and met with Vladimir Putin for a two-day summit that ended yesterday. They called for both the U.S. and South Korea to cease their massive joint military exercises and for the U.S. to immediately cancel the deployment of the THAAD missile system. Interestingly, the South Korean president had criticized the U.S. in June, saying that he wasn't even told that they had brought in more launchers while he was president, that the U.S. brought in more launchers to add to the THAAD system.
Well, that's true. And unfortunately, because of the enormous pressure that the United States places on South Korea economically, politically, and also militarily, I mean, the U.S. has wartime operational control over South Korea. Unfortunately, Moon Jae-in, even though South Korea is the 10th largest military in the world and the 11th largest economy in the world, it still has to play this clientelistic relationship with the United States. And so he has to toe this very gentle line, even though he has enormous backing from the Korean people and has an 80% popularity rating. He unfortunately has, he's stalled it, but I'm not sure if they have the courage to basically reject it. And, recently we just had a Korea Peace Network conference in Washington, D.C., and we had former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and he was asked a question about the THAAD missile defense system. And he basically said, that won't do anything to protect the South Koreans. Also, the missile defense system is questionable in itself. But, it definitely won't protect South Korea. It's definitely there to protect U.S., bases in the region. And if the South Koreans want to remove it, by all means, they should have that right to do so. But unfortunately, I don't think that is the sentiment of the Trump administration. We know that they are a bully administration around the world. And my hope was that South Korea would stand up just the way that Germany and France and Australia and other historic allies of the United States to say, this is not benefiting the people of South Korea and our security. We have the right to defend the country in the way that we think would advance peace on the Korean Peninsula, and they want inter-Korean engagement. And so perhaps that's one win that came out of the Moon Jae-in and Trump summit was that, President Moon did walk away from the summit with a somewhat stamp of approval from the Trump administration. And it's so crazy that it's 2017 and South Korea has to basically ask for that. But that's what he left with. He left with an approval from the Trump administration to pursue inter-Korean dialogue. And, hopefully they will succeed in doing so. But by basically towing the Trump administration line on North Korea, they're not going to get very far.
Your concerns about North Korea launching this intercontinental ballistic missile, this ICBM, Christine?
Well, of course. I mean, we don't want any ICBM to strike the United States, but I have never seen any indication that North Korea would use it proactively or preemptively. They would only do so in reaction to any kind of first strike from the United States. And what is so disheartening is that, again, going back to Bill Perry and him reminding us that in the late 1998, at the end of the Clinton administration, 1999-2000, we were this close to basically stalling North Korea's nuclear. He had already frozen North Korea's nuclear program, but had worked to basically stall their missile program. And all North Korea wanted was some kind of non-aggression pact, not even a peace treaty. And they had come this close. The number 2 under Kim Jong-il had come to the White House, met with Bill Clinton. Clinton was supposed to go to North Korea. But unfortunately, because of the Florida, the Bush-Al Gore presidential election, he was not able to do so. And, when the Bush administration came into office, we have to remember it was the preemptive doctrine that really set off for North Koreans, seeing what happened in Iraq, seeing what happened in Afghanistan and Libya subsequently, that they had to do what they had to do to defend their country. And unfortunately, pursuing nuclear weapons and now having some kind of delivery capability through this long-range missile to strike the United States is one way to get the United States to come to some kind of negotiating table. And that is an unfortunate reality, but that is where we're at. And every major, I think, serious Korea expert, from military officials to former, diplomats, we saw now a bipartisan letter from former Secretary of State Schultz to who else was there? Bill Perry signed the letter. I mean, it went to Donald Trump and it said diplomacy and negotiation is the only way forward with the North Koreans. And so before they really do have the capability to strike the United States, we need to negotiate some kind of deal.
Christine Ahn, we want to thank you for being with us, founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing for peace in Korea, North and South. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Back in a minute.
Sweat and a lot of limbs. We didn't wait for a bell to ring. We're unprofessional wrestling. Watch out the stray mattress springs. That carpet burn, it's gonna sting. I can wear a leotard if that's your thing. We're unprofessional wrestling. I don't even try to stop what looks like a figure 4-leg lock. I don't even care who wins. We're unprofessional wrestling. I don't think you know what to do. We're both still learning how to do these.
Unprofessional Wrestling by Art Brut here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Dozens of state lawmakers and civil rights groups have denounced an election commission established by Donald Trump, which has asked all 50 states to hand over detailed personal information about U.S. voters. The request was made by Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State and vice chair of Trump's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. In a letter addressed to secretaries of state and other officials across the country, Kobach requests, quote, the full first and last names of all registrants, addresses, dates of birth, political party, last 4 digits of Social Security number if available, voter history from 2006 onward, information regarding any felony convictions, information regarding voter registration in another state, information regarding military status and overseas citizen information. Kobach recently defended his request on MSNBC.
This is publicly available information. The commission is only requesting what any person on the street in California can walk into a county election office and get. So if Social Security number is not publicly available, and it is not publicly available in most states, then we aren't requesting it. So why
44 states to date have said they would refuse to comply with Kobach's request. Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe blasted the request in a statement, saying, quote, I have no intention of honoring this request. Virginia conducts fair, honest, and democratic elections, and there's no evidence of significant voter fraud in Virginia. This entire commission is based on the specious and false notion that there was widespread voter fraud last November. At best, this commission was set up as a pretext to validate Donald Trump's alternative election facts, and at worst is a tool to commit large-scale voter suppression, the Virginia governor wrote. On Saturday, Trump called out states that are refusing to turn over the information, tweeting, numerous states are refusing to give information to the very distinguished voter fraud panel. What are they trying to hide? He tweeted. Meanwhile, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has called on the U.S. Office of Special Counsel to investigate whether Kobach violated the Hatch Act, a 1939 law that limits certain political activities of federal employees. Kobach announced last month he's running as a Republican candidate for governor of Kansas. The Lawyers Committee alleges Kobach may have violated the law by highlighting his role on the commission and campaign materials. For more, we're joined by two guests, Kristen Clarke, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Ari Berman, Senior Contributing Writer for The Nation, where he covers voting rights. He wrote about Chris Kobach in the New York Times Magazine in an article, The Man Behind Trump's Voter Fraud Obsession. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Kristen Clarke, let's begin with you. You are suing?
So what we have done is we've filed a complaint against Chris Kobach under a federal law known as the Hatch Act. This is a law that was passed by Congress in 1939, and it prohibits federal employees from using their official government position to engage in political activity. It prohibits government employees from soliciting political contributions. So Chris Kobach is running this commission. He was appointed by the president to serve as vice chair. And several weeks after he was appointed to that role, he announced that he was running for governor of Kansas. Since that time, he has actively exploited his role as the vice chair of the Election Integrity Commission to promote his gubernatorial bid. In our complaint to the Office of Special Counsel, which is housed inside the Justice Department, we lay out extensive evidence in which we show that Chris Kobach would appear in a news interview. For example, on June 30th, he appeared on Fox News and MSNBC and other networks to talk about his role leading the Election Integrity Commission. In the next breath, he promotes those appearances on his political campaign sites, on his social media sites linked to the campaign, and solicits political contributions around those media appearances. This conduct, we believe, runs afoul of the Hatch Act. We don't know if Mr. Kobach agreed to serve in this commission because his goal ultimately was to use his role to promote his gubernatorial bid. But what we know is that these are not isolated instances, but a pattern in which Kobach talks about his work with the commission and then goes out and uses those media appearances to solicit political contributions and to promote his governor bid.
Can you talk about the 44 states refusing to hand over information to this election commission?
So we should qualify. There are 44 states that have said that they will not fully comply with the president's request. And so we continue to keep those states under a microscope. There are many state privacy laws that simply prohibit state election officials from disclosing the vast amount of data that this so-called Election Integrity Commission seeks. Social security numbers, date of birth, address information. There actually just is no way for many states to disclose the kind of data that the commission seeks. So some states have said that they outright will not participate in any fashion. Some of those states include California and Virginia and New York and Kentucky, and we applaud those states. But there are a number of states that are saying, you know, we may be able to give you something. You have to make your request in the way that anyone else would. You have to pay for the data that we provide. And so we're watching closely to see how much states turn over. At the end of the day, we don't believe that any state should participate in this commission. The goals of this commission are clear. This commission was set up to lay the groundwork for a massive push of voter suppression laws and policies on a national scale. We think that goal is a very dangerous one. And our hope ultimately is that states will not in any way legitimize the work of this commission by turning over data that could be ultimately abused by cyber hackers. There are 200 million registered voters in our country, and we've never seen an effort like this to comb and pull together this extensive and vast amount of data on individuals in our country. So we're going to be watching closely to see what states do. This week, Secretaries of State will be convening at the National Association of Secretaries of State. They're holding an annual summer meeting in Indianapolis, and our hope is that at that forum we will see secretaries of state collectively take action to condemn the commission and make clear that they won't allow this federal overreach to interrupt the good work that they are doing across our country to maintain their own state registration rolls and the work that they're doing to carry out their job.
Ari Berman, even Kansas, where Kobach is Secretary of State, has refused to hand over some information.
Well, this is amazing. So Chris Kobach asked all of these states for what he called publicly available data. But a lot of the data was, in fact, not publicly available. Social Security numbers, party affiliation, criminal history, military history. His own state, he is the Secretary of State. He could not comply with this. Amazing letters from members of Trump's own Election Integrity Commission said they would not comply with this request. The Maine Secretary of State denied Kobach's request. The Indiana Secretary of State, Mike Pence's home state, he's the chair of the commission, said she would not comply with this request. So it seems like Kobach, number one, did not think this through at all in terms of what was publicly available, and number two, did not consult with members of his own commission in terms of what he was asking for.
Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach has defended President Trump's unfounded claim that millions of people illegally voted, supposedly costing Trump the popular vote. He lost by, what, about 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton, but won the Electoral College. This is Kansas Secretary of State Kobach being questioned by reporters.
I think the president-elect is absolutely correct when he says the number of illegal votes cast exceeds the popular vote margin between him and Hillary Clinton at this point.
What tangible evidence is there that that actually happened?
Well, this is the problem with aliens voting and aliens registering. There's no way you can look on the voter rolls and say, this one's an alien, this one's a citizen, this one's an alien. Once a person gets on the voter rolls, you don't have any way of easily identifying them as aliens. And so you have to rely on post-election studies like the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, where you get data from aliens themselves saying, oh yeah, I voted. It does appear that aliens do vote in very large numbers.
So that was Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach in November, right after the election. In February, he again claimed there was widespread voter fraud in the presidential election. Here he is sparring with CNN anchor Kate Baldwin.
Of the 30 states, we have about 3 million people who are registered in more than one state, and that's not a crime. That's just an administrative bookkeeping.
Including the president's son-in-law, including the president's Treasury Secretary.
Exactly, yeah. And many of your viewers are probably registered in more than one state. But what is a crime is if you actually vote in both of those states or in more than two states.
Of course it's a crime.
And every
but where
year,
is the evidence of this widespread, rampant, millions of people voting? If it had happened, why haven't we seen it, Secretary?
Well, actually, maybe I don't know if your network has covered it, but in my state, just people voting in Kansas and another state, my office prosecutes it. I just got that prosecutorial authority a year and a half ago. We've already filed 9 cases.
From the notes that I saw, and we have
6 guilty pleas.
Right. 6 guilty pleas, 1 dismissed, 2 pending. That says January 25th. 9 cases does not rampant, widespread voter fraud make.
So that was CNN host Kate Baldwin questioning Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State of Kansas. Ari Berman.
Well, it's important to note, first off, that Kobach is really the leading architect of voter suppression efforts nationwide. He's not just the Secretary of State of Kansas. He's been going all around the country trying to put in place suppressive voting laws. So one of the laws that Kansas has in place, for example, is proof of citizenship for voter registration. You have to have a passport, a birth certificate, or naturalization papers to be registered to vote in Kansas if you register after 2013. Most people don't carry around those documents with them when they go to register to vote. So in Kansas, 1 in 7 new registrants have been blocked from voting because of this one law alone. And Kobach says he wants to see proof of citizenship laws in every state, which would have an unbelievably suppressive effect on voter registration and disenfranchise millions of people. So Kobach has been going all around the country claiming that voter fraud is widespread, trying to build support for President Trump's lie that millions of people voted illegally to then put in place policies like proof of citizenship for registration that make it very, very difficult to register to vote. And it's interesting, you know, for my New York Times Magazine article, I looked into all of Kobach's claims about voter fraud. And I found, number one, that non-citizen registration is exceedingly rare nationwide. There's no reason why a non-citizen would register to vote and risk a felony and deportation. The second thing is that Kobach is the only Secretary of State in the country with the power to personally prosecute voter fraud cases. So he can actually bring these cases. And of all the cases in Kansas, he's only convicted one non-citizen of voting. So if it was so widespread, you'd think that in Kansas, where he has prosecutorial power, he would be able to show this, but he has not shown this. And this entire commission is predicated on this gigantic lie that millions of people voted illegally. And Kobach is the one who's whispering in Trump's ear, telling him this, and then trying to prove this evidence. That's why he wanted this data from all 50 states, even though there's no evidence to show that voter fraud is widespread.
So let's talk more about your New York Times Magazine piece, Ari Berman, the man behind Trump's voter fraud obsession. Give us Chris Kobach's history.
So Chris Kobach is interesting because before he was a leading proponent of voter suppression, he was a leading proponent of restricting immigration. And most people think of these issues as separate. They think of immigration and they think of voting. But what Kobach has tried to do is combine these two issues. So first, he drafted all of these anti-immigration laws, like Arizona's SB 1070, which was the Papers, Please law, where police could stop anyone and check their citizenship based on reasonable suspicion if they were in the country illegally. He went all around the country drafting these laws. Then he became Secretary of State of Kansas and started drafting anti-voting laws. And basically what he was saying was that all of these people were in the country illegally and that they were voting illegally as well. So he combined anti-immigrant sentiment with policies that would restrict voting rights. And I think the goal here is twofold. First, it's to try to boost the Republican Party in terms of eliminating the pool of voters who could be citizens and then eliminating the electorate itself. But number two, to try to preserve America's shrinking white majority. He is looking at the demographics of the country. He's seeing how the demographics of the country are changing. He's seeing how white people are becoming a minority in many states. And they're pushing both anti-immigrant policies and voter suppression policies to try to protect the Republican Party and try to protect the shrinking white majority in this country.
Talk about his connections to white supremacist right-wing groups.
Well, this was really alarming. So since 2003, 2004, Kobach has been counsel to a group called FAIR, Federations for American Immigration Reform, which is called a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, really the main group that's promoted restricting immigration. The founder of that group, John Tanton, who is an ophthalmologist in Michigan, has said unbelievably racist things about Latinos. Has said there was going to be an explosion of whites against Latinos in the U.S., has republished a book called Camp of the Saints, a French novel that's unbelievably racist. Steve Bannon is one of its friends. So that's one of Kobach's influences. Another influence was Samuel Huntington from Harvard, who was a longtime professor there, known for his work, The Clash of Civilizations. But Huntington really had two very radical ideas that influenced Kobach. The first was that there's such a thing as too much democracy. After things like the Voting Rights Act were passed, Huntington worried about the effect that, quote unquote, the blacks would have on the political system. The second thing Huntington denounced was the Hispanicization of the U.S., the idea that Latino immigrants were threatening Anglo-Protestant Christian values in the U.S. And so Kobach talks about the rule of law. He talks about voter fraud. He talks about these things.
Huntington was the mentor of
Kobach when Kobach was at Harvard. So Kobach talks about all of these things like the rule of law and voter fraud, like it's just these common sense things. But you scratch right below the surface and you realize that his intellectual influences are really leading proponents of white nationalism and white supremacy in the U.S.
His relationship with Sheriff Joe Arpaio when he was there in Arizona.
He had a very close relationship to Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona, who branded himself America's toughest sheriff and was subsequently sued by the Justice Department for racial profiling and held in contempt of court by a federal court. Kobach was really the guy who sold Arpaio on the idea of mass deportation. Kobach had this idea called attrition through enforcement, which really became known as self-deportation. And the idea is you make life so miserable for immigrants that they will just leave the U.S. So Kobach is really the guy who ended up getting Arpaio in all this legal trouble by claiming he had this authority that he never had.
What about those who say the point of this commission is simply to identify and then suppress votes of those you don't want to be voting? Where does this commission go now with 44 states refusing to either fully or partly comply with the information requests from Kobach's commission?
Well, I think Trump's commission is still going to make the argument that voter fraud is widespread, rampant, and massive, and we have to put in place all of these policies to try to suppress votes in reaction to that. But the point is, we're seeing they're not even going to get the data to be able to do this kind of analysis. So to me, this entire commission is a sham. The fact that all of these states have refused to hand over the data means that this commission, in my view, should be disbanded. It serves no purpose at this point.
Kristen Clark, do you see that happening? Where do you see this commission going and your complaint going?
Well, we hope that they will revoke the Election Integrity Commission. We believe that it has a baseless mission, which is to substantiate the president's false allegations about widespread vote fraud. They have put together a dream team of voter suppression proponents, not just Chris Kobach, but Hans von Spakovsky. It's also rumored that Ken Blackwell, former Secretary of State of Ohio. I mean, these are folks who have made a career out of erecting barriers to the ballot box around our country. Ken Blackwell, during his tenure as Secretary of State, rejected voter registration forms that he thought were not printed on the right paperweight. Hans von Spakovsky is someone who has championed voter ID laws and championed laws that seek to make it harder for people to vote, including taking away the right to vote from people with a criminal history. When you peel back the layers, the goal of this commission is clear. It is intended to lay the groundwork for voter suppression laws across our country. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law filed this Hatch Act complaint against Chris Kobach, but we think that the commission as it stands today is illegitimate. You have states around the country that are saying that they will refuse to participate. We intend to continue to bring pressure on other states to discourage them from turning over data or information of any kind to this illegitimate commission. We know that there are folks in Congress who are introducing legislation calling for the defunding of the commission and calling for revocation of the commission. I think those are important points. This is a waste of taxpayer dollars at the end of the day. And all of this is coming at a time where we're seeing the Justice Department turning the clock back on federal civil rights enforcement, including enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. We need to return our focus in this country to doing work that brings people into the process and get to a place where all eligible Americans are able to participate in our democracy, and the commission runs against that important goal.
Kristen Clark, I want to thank you for being with us, head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and thanks so much to Ari Berman of The Nation. We'll link to your piece in the New York Times, the man behind Trump's voter fraud obsession. Ari Berman is author of the book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Beirut, Lebanon. Stay with us.
De amor del pueblo lenca, una canción de luchas que recuenta el tiempo, que haga memoria de tanta gente y que alce grande y fuerte a nuestra Berta. Canción mujer que hace historia, guardiana de
Una canción de amor, a love song by Honduran singer Carla Lara. On Friday, Berta Zuniga Cáceres, the daughter of the murdered Honduran indigenous environmental leader Berta Cáceres, herself survived an attempted attack by men wielding machetes. We'll have more on that story later on Thursday on Democracy Now! Yes, this is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Foreign ministers of Bahrain, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are meeting today amidst a diplomatic standoff with the Gulf nation of Qatar. The nations broke off relations with Qatar a month ago and imposed sanctions on the small Gulf country, accusing it of destabilizing the Middle East by backing militant groups, including ISIS and al-Qaeda. Qatar has denied the accusations. The Saudi-led coalition issued 13 demands on Qatar, including the closing of Al Jazeera TV channel. Other demands include ending Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood, downgrading diplomatic ties with Iran, and closing a Turkish military base in Qatar. On Monday, Qatar responded to the demands, but Qatar's response has not been made public. Qatar's foreign minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, spoke in Germany.
What we have seen that the list is unrealistic and it cannot be actioned, and it's not talking about terrorism. Mainly it's talking about shutting the freedom of speech, infringing the sovereignty of a country, interfering in its affairs. There are lots of items which any country can find it offensive within the international law and international norms.
The diplomatic standoff began soon after President Trump met Saudi King Salman in Riyadh. Trump has endorsed the isolation of Qatar, even though the Gulf nation is home to a major U.S. military base. He actually took credit for the isolation of Qatar. But Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has called for an end to the blockade of Qatar. To talk more about the diplomatic standoff in the Gulf, we go to Beirut, where we're joined by Rami Khouri, professor of journalism and senior public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. He's also an internationally syndicated columnist, a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. Rami Khouri, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what's happening here.
Well, what's happening is essentially the two most powerful countries in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are trying desperately to hold back waves of change all around the Middle East that they don't like, and that other people don't like the government of Egypt that took power essentially through a military coup, and other groups around the world and around the region that want to maintain the old order that has ruled and ruined this Arab region for the last 50, 60 years. In other words, they're trying to stop popular activism, democratic elections, Islamist groups who seem to represent a pretty clear majority of sentiments, peaceful, nonviolent Islamist groups like the Muslim Brothers mostly. They're trying to stop these kinds of things from happening, normal relations with Iran, things of that nature, and a free media like what Jazeera represents. That's the essential battle between the hardline, regressive perceptions and aspirations of the Saudi and Emirati regimes that just want to freeze the region like it has been for the last 50, 60 years, and other forces, including massive popular forces that erupted in uprisings 6, 7 years ago, that want to see an evolution with more dignity, more participation, more accountability, and ideally some more democracy as well. That's the essential battle. The Emirati and Saudi pressures on the Qataris were very sudden and very fierce, and they have essentially gotten no support anywhere around the world of any significance. Briefly, Trump supported them, and then when he was briefed about what actual American interests and policies are in the Gulf, he kind of pulled back from that a little bit. And Trump now has directly called the leaders involved and urged them to negotiate a peaceful diplomatic resolution of this conflict, which is the sensible thing to do. And the Qataris have stood their ground because they basically say, these accusations are, first of all, mostly exaggerated or unfounded. Second of all, if there are accusations that have a grain of truth in them, for instance, the Saudis don't want the Qataris to have ties with Iran. Well, the reality is that Dubai and the UAE has much more trading relationships with Iran than Qatar does, and so does Kuwait and the Omanis as well. So there's just a lot of hypocrisy in these accusations, and also a sense that this is predatory and bullying, that they're trying essentially to get Qatar to follow the same policies as the Saudis and the Emiratis, and the Qataris won't do it, and they're holding their ground. They're getting a lot of support internationally, and they want to solve this peacefully. Just as right now, as we speak on the air, the Qatari foreign minister is giving a briefing at Chatham House in London in which he's explaining the Qatari position, in which he's pointed out that some of the accusations that have some legitimacy, for instance, there may have been people living in Qatar who were on a banned UN list or something like that. He says, well, we've taken action on those. So the Qataris are not against responding to legitimate grievances. But the grievances and these non-negotiable demands have been so fierce and brutal and exaggerated that they just have no credibility. And then the Saudis and Emiratis are pretty much stuck in a corner now. We'll see what they're going to announce later this afternoon
Rami,
in Cairo.
I'd like to turn to Al Jazeera's response to the accusations leveled against the network by Saudi Arabia and its regional allies. This is Gilles Trendle, the acting managing director of Al Jazeera English, speaking to the BBC.
There are many accusations made against Al Jazeera, and I think all those accusations are a bit of a red herring. In the end, it's about us providing fair and frank coverage. We're not partisan to any particular group or ideology or government. We provide a diversity of different viewpoints and perspectives, and I think that's a problem for some people in the region.
So that's the acting managing director of Al Jazeera English, Rami Khouri, your response. And do you see the possibility that Al Jazeera will be closed?
I don't think there's any real possibility. If they do close Jazeera, it would be quite a catastrophe. And essentially, it would say that Qatar has agreed to be a vassal state of the Saudi Arabians, like Bahrain has become a vassal state, and Egypt is dangerously close to being a protectorate of the oil-rich Gulf countries. I don't think it's going to happen. You know, the accusations against Jazeera, I've written about this quite a bit recently. These are really tangential issues. The complaints against Jazeera often are perfectly normal complaints against media organs. You know, a lot of people complain that Democracy Now! Is a very left-wing, progressive oriented station or program, and therefore they criticize you. Well, you have a right to be progressive, and somebody has a right to be Arab nationalist. Somebody has a right to be friendly with peaceful Islamists, and people have these views. Fox has a view, CNN has a view, you have a view, MSNBC has a view, and that if those accusations are the best that the Saudis and Emiratis can come up with, then they're able to understand now why nobody really is going along with them, and the whole world is standing up for Jazeera and the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is what masses of hundreds of millions of Arabs stood up and asked for in 2010, 2011. They were prepared to die, and thousands have died, asking for their dignity and their human rights and their social justice. They're battling for these intangibles that they want to express because they've not had a chance in the last 50, 60 years in most Arab countries to use their full mind and their intellect and their cultural capabilities. They've been controlled by governments, ministries of information, thought control kernels, and all kinds of institutions that essentially turn citizens into cattle or robots. And the governments of many Arab countries continue to do this. And the Jazeera represents the opposite. Jazeera is not the problem, and Qatar is not the problem. The Saudis and Emiratis and Egyptians have taken Jazeera as a proxy for Qatar, and have taken Qatar as a proxy for the normal evolution of hundreds of millions of people in the Arab world who simply want to live as dignified human beings with a little bit more freedom, more participation, more accountability, a variety of friends all around the region, and letting the full human capabilities of people to express themselves to build strong, decent, peaceful, just countries. And this is really the problem that we have. Jazeera is not is not the issue. Jazeera is just a proxy.
Rami Khouri, in the last minute we have, I want to ask you about this latest story in Lebanon where you are. The two separate fires that tore through Syrian refugee camps, killing a small child, injuring scores of people. Can you tell us what's happening there? Then we'll continue in a post-show discussion.
Well, there's over 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon that have come in over the last 6 years. Most of them are scattered in haphazard local communities that have been set up, unofficial camps. A lot of them are getting support from international agencies, and the government is helping out by opening schools and doing other things. But it's quite a chaotic situation in the sense that there's nobody really in charge of their well-being, and they don't have many options to go back to Syria or to stay here permanently. Many of them can't work. Many work illegally. They're mostly poor, and the conditions are very haphazard, and therefore fires. We just had a very strong 10 days of intense heat, and therefore if these fires break out, and you have the
Rami,
problem
we
that
have to
some of
leave
these...
it there, but we're going to continue and post online at democracynow.org. Rami Khouri, professor of journalism at American University in Beirut. Thanks for joining us.